We are joined now by Todd Fuhrman, a man who is still recovering from the Houston Texans' collapse late against the Tennessee Titans. Todd, I'll start there. Where does that rank on the bad beat scale when the Texans are up 7, they go for 2 to try to go up 9, don't get it, so they're stuck at 7, Titans come back, score with 4 seconds left, win the toss in overtime, go down and immediately score a touchdown to cover the 4?
I think this is a bad connection right now because I typically only let losses linger for about 24 hours, absolute max. But watching that football game, there's no doubt that the Tennessee Titans were the better football team, but the better football team always doesn't win and cover. And when you have a 7-point lead with about a minute to go and a chance to make it a 9-point game, you figure more often than not that you're in pretty good standing. Mike Vrabel obviously kicks the extra point at the end of regulation. Then you just need the Houston Texans to win the coin toss, hoping worst-case scenario it ends in a field goal. But alas, when it rains, it pours, and then you can claim bad beat, whereas betting the Dallas Cowboys on Monday night was just a bad bet.
So, yeah, no kidding, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I want to dive into the larger analytics decision that are being made here. It seems like analytics have arrived this season, maybe more than any other, in a big way in terms of two-point conversion decisions. And the Romeo Crennel decision at the end of the game was one that is emblematic, I think, of the way the game is being played right now. And what I mean by that is Romeo Crennel made the decision to go for a 9-point lead instead of kicking the extra point to take an 8-point lead. For most of our lives as football fans, that would have been a crazy decision to make. It now is becoming far more commonplace. You are a lot better with math and analytics in general than certainly I am, and certainly the average person who is listening to our show out there is. Do you think this is a change that's going to last for a long time to come? And for people who are still trying to grapple with, like we talked with Jason Whitlock on Tuesday's show, and he was like, I didn't like the decision. Actually, on our text chain, Sal is like, he's a pretty good math guy, but he's not happy with it. Is it the right decision to go for 2 there?
In my opinion, it 100% is. If you can win the game on a single play like that and taking your margin from a 1-score game to a 2-score game, knowing that the probability, if you look at the numbers over the historical sample size, you hit the 2-point conversion at better than a 50% clip, you want to try and take full advantage. And the way that the Houston Texans had defended the Tennessee Titans all day long, this scenario ultimately played out that, sure, they could have potentially gone up 8, but let's not ignore the fact that they had missed an extra point earlier in the game, so that wasn't a gimme. And they couldn't stop Tennessee at all once Derrick Henry got going. So if you can win it with your offense on one play, you take full advantage, and I'll always applaud the aggressive approach. Jeffrey Simmons made an outstanding play batting that ball down with a wide-open receiver, and it's the same reason when you talk about the analytics in the grand scheme of things, looking at coaches down 14, going for a 2-point conversion to make it a 6-point game. Worst-case scenario, if you fail on the 2-pointer, you're still only down 1 score, and I think this is the way that the game is going. But for all the traditionalists out there that go, well, you still have to convert the 2-point conversion, and it's a one-possession game. Ultimately, I think it's hard to defend some of these actions in these late game situations because we've grown so accustomed to one thought process, and it's easier to go, well, we played for the tie and we ultimately lost. But if you can win the game with your offense, and every situation is a little bit different, I think you take full advantage. Whereas in the Washington-New York Giants game, I was a little bit surprised that Ron Rivera went for 2 with a late touchdown for Washington, knowing that the Giants hadn't done anything offensively to drive the football. They'd scored 1 offensive touchdown in that game. They ultimately took the lead because of a scoop and score. In that spot, I'd have trusted my defense to force a 3-and-out, get the ball back for Kyle Allen, and try and win it by a field goal.
What do you think? So there's another interesting statistical decision, I think, from a win percentage perspective when you break down going forward there that I thought was really pretty intriguing. And that was the decision, if you break it down. Vrabel, they put Derrick Henry into the Wildcat on 3rd and 5 in overtime. And he said after the game, hey, we did that because we were going to go for the touchdown as opposed to kick the field goal. In overtime, you win the game with a touchdown. You kick a field goal, you continue to play. Would the analytics be if it's 4th and goal from the 1 or 2 that's the right call to make?
That's a little bit of a different situation because Vrabel can easily say that now, but if Derrick Henry gets tackled in the backfield and you're looking at a 4th and 6 or a 4th and goal from the 6-yard line.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the dynamic changes quite a bit, but the reason you pay Derrick Henry what you do is you expect in crunch time and a 4th and short should the situation arise that you're going to give your horse the football. And if Vrabel went into it with the mindset that, hey, look, if he gets down to the 2-yard line, we're still going to go for it, I give him a ton of credit because let's not kid ourselves, for as well as the Titans have played, there are a lot of questions about this team on the defensive side of the ball. And people who look at the final stat sheet and go, yeah, well, the Titans outgained the Texans by almost 200 yards. Well, 160 of those yards came on the drive at the end of regulation to tie it, and ultimately the game-winning drive in overtime. So I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics in play. And while you don't want to let analytics rule every single decision, I'm all for coaches trying to win football games and take full advantage if you trust your offense in those positions, playing the strength rather than the way the game has shifted, leaning on a defense that a lot of times hasn't been able to get stops, especially against some of these high-powered attacks.
We're talking to Todd Fuhrman. You can follow him on Twitter at Todd Fuhrman. You can see him on Fox Bet Live, used to be called Lock It In. You mentioned a minute ago the Cowboys, and the NFC East in general is just a dumpster fire. How do you assess the NFC East going forward? Cowboys are in the lead at 2-4. Amazingly, the Eagles are only a half game out. I mean, every team is still somewhat alive because of how bad it has been. How many wins this division?
Yeah, honestly, I would have said 8 before we saw the games unfold this weekend. Now I'm of the mindset that it may take 7, even 6, ultimately could get things done because you look at the Cowboys, and we saw on Monday night, when you don't have an offensive line, Andy Dalton isn't dynamic enough as a starting quarterback to make plays with his legs, extend plays. He's not cut from the same cloth as Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, or Josh Allen by any stretch of the imagination. And Dallas's defense, quite frankly, isn't good enough to hold up if they're going to try and win 21-17 football games. Meanwhile, you look at Philadelphia, we know that Miles Sanders and Zach Ertz aren't going to be available tomorrow night when they take on the Giants. And suddenly it's a New York Giants team on the heels of a 1-point victory against Washington that if they can beat Philadelphia as short road underdogs, we're talking about them being in a flat-footed tie for first, trending in the right direction. But I think when you look at all of these teams, if Washington can figure out its identity offensively, they actually become a legitimate dark horse because they have a unit that I would define as elite, which would be their defense. And compared to everybody else in this particular division, Philadelphia has question marks on both sides. The Giants do as well. And while we would have said Dallas's offense was elite beforehand, I'm not sure with all of these offensive line injuries mounting that it's going to allow the Cowboys to overcome some of their defensive frailty.
What happens in the biggest game of the weekend, which I'm excited to say, is the Steelers at the Titans. How would you assess this one? 2 5-0 teams, but big injuries, season-ending injuries to Devin Bush on the Steelers and to Taylor Lewan on the Titans. How do you assess both teams going forward with those kind of injuries, and how much of an impact do you assess to those two guys being out for the rest of the season?
It's pretty wild when you look at these two teams, both 5-0, kind of in the catbird seat, at least theoretically for the number 1 overall seed in the AFC. Ultimately, I believe Kansas City is going to have that honor bestowed on them when they run the table or get close to with a 13-3 type of record. Those two injuries are massive, especially in this matchup, because you need physical, downhill attacking linebackers like Devin Bush provides to slow down a ground and pound attack that the Titans have done so well with Derrick Henry leading the charge. Meanwhile, on the other side, the key to beating the Steelers is protecting your quarterback. And suddenly, without Taylor Lewan on the offensive line, you're going to see Ryan Tannehill either having to roll out, get the ball out of his hands quickly against this ferocious Steelers pass rush, because I do think the Steelers secondary is vulnerable the same way that I think the Tennessee Titans can be beaten on that defensive side of the ball. I'm actually surprised when this number opened that the Steelers were a 1-point favorite, being bet out a little bit, still in no man's land. But when we hit the rewind button when this game was originally supposed to be played, it was the Titans actually opening as a short favorite. Number did ultimately flip, and odds makers haven't forgotten that, using the Steelers as short road favorites. But this is a game that, unless something drastic changes, I probably won't have an investment in by any stretch. Can see the game going over the total, as both these offenses should probably have some success someday.
It's interesting. The Bills at 4-0 when they came in to play against the Titans were a fairly substantial favorite, and 3.5, 4-point favorite. I think it was. The Bills went off. They got whipped pretty solidly, and then they didn't look very good in the early game on Monday Night Football a couple of days ago. How do you assess the Bills now going forward? They were 4-0 and people were really impressed with them. They're now 4-2. I know they get to go against the Jets, so that's going to be a win. Kind of hard to gauge anybody against the Jets given how bad the Jets are. But how would you assess the Bills now compared to what you thought of them when they were 4-0?
Well, a 3-game stretch coming up. You mentioned the fact that they'll play the Jets on the road as double-digit favorites, a game they obviously can't afford to lose if they want to be considered contenders within the AFC and maintain that stranglehold, so to speak, on the AFC East. And then they have 2 home dates that are rather intriguing. A Patriots team that's really owned them over the years that has a lot different look and feel with Cam Newton than it did with Tom Brady. And then a home date after that against the Seattle Seahawks. And we know Seattle has as explosive an offense as we've seen in the NFL. The problem for Buffalo, and Josh Allen's going to get a lot of the blame for what went on each of the last 2 weeks, is that this defense has regressed substantially from where they were a season ago. Clyde Edwards-Helaire went bonkers running the football. The Chiefs rattle off more than 200 yards in that game, and whether it was by design or just Buffalo's inability to get off the field, something has to change there. And you look at Matt Milano, their linebacker, who's key in coverage. He's got to get healthy for this team. But Brian Daboll, ultimately, offensively, I think they're going to be okay. But defensively, I'm not sure you can fix everything that's been wrong with Buffalo and just wave that magic wand.
We've talked a lot on this show, and it's been a regular storyline of the NFL season. Who's going to win the divorce, Tom Brady or Bill Belichick? Through 6 weeks now, the Bucs are now 4-2, coming off a huge win over the Packers. And it feels like to me this is a foregone conclusion. The Bucs are a legitimate threat in the NFC. I don't even think the Patriots are going to make the playoffs. How would you assess right now?
I think that's a fair statement to try and make. When you look at New England, we knew that this year was going to be a transitional season, even if they got Cam Newton at his absolute best, just because they didn't have the skill position talent to surround him. They had so many key contributors on the defense a season ago also opt out, and you've kind of seen that on display when they step up in class and take on, some of those offenses in the upper echelon. Meanwhile, Tom handpicked his situation. He walked right into a team that was more or less plug and play with an offensive skill cast that we've made the case is maybe better than he's ever been surrounded by during his illustrious career. And defensively, Todd Bowles and Casey Rogers have built this unit into a team that can at least get after the quarterback, as we saw on Sunday. And even with the loss of Vita Vea, they were better against the run. I think the Bucs are poised to be a threat in the NFC, whereas, as you mentioned, New England kind of going to be an afterthought in the AFC. And if they're able to get into the playoffs, it'll be as a wild card team fighting for that 5, 6, or 7 seed.
All right, I want to dive into college football now. I think that Alabama and Clemson have effectively gone ahead and punched their ticket into the playoff. Now, crazy things can happen, obviously. As we all know, 2020 is one of the craziest years in American history. But in the world of college football, what I saw from Alabama against Georgia convinced me that they're going to be there. I think Alabama arguably has already played their 2 toughest games against Texas A&M and against Georgia, and they won them both handily. And now, as you look forward, I think Clemson is a lot better than Notre Dame. I just don't see anybody that's keeping Clemson from being 10-1 at worst in the ACC. Do you agree with me? Both those teams are pretty much foregone conclusions. How would you assess the rest of the college football picture?
I would say that 3 playoff positions are probably already taken, and one of those would be by a team that hasn't even played a game yet in the Ohio State Buckeyes. When you look at their talent top to bottom, I would be stunned if that program completely cratered. So their schedule will be a little bit more difficult trying to navigate through the rigors of the Big Ten East. Of course, we'll see how those Big Ten schedules ultimately unfold if Ohio State's even able to play their full regular season. But if we're talking about those 3 teams being in the mix or at least controlling their own destiny to be able to make things happen, then it opens up the question of, is it a Pac-12 team that gets in? If USC goes undefeated, are they considered better from an overall power profile than a Georgia team that could realistically finish the regular season 9-1, have a win over Florida on their resume, and a massive revenge date on deck with Alabama in the SEC title? Because I do think Georgia is that good. And this is where the College Football Playoff Committee, in my opinion, missed a golden opportunity to kind of expand the playoff format, take a lot of the conference champions, and just put 8 teams in the mix, because comparing apples to apples is going to be even harder in 2020 than what it normally is, especially if you have teams from these Power 5 conferences that are playing unbalanced schedules running the table, because wins later in the year may carry a little bit more weight, knowing the Pac-12 is not even going to play its first football game until early November.
Don't you think, let's circle back around, the Cowboys really have to fire Jason Garrett now?
Jason Garrett has long since been gone, and so he'll take.
Do you think that he is taking some perverse joy in the Cowboys stinking?
You know what? You always wonder that fact, and he may be lying his head on the pillow at night going, you know what? This just proves to
it's
all
not
those
like
Cowboys
the Giants
fans.
are any good. So, I mean, that probably doesn't help very much.
But I think the Giants are a team that knew there were going to be some growing pains, and Jason Garrett will be given a longer leash. But, ultimately the Cowboys were a flawed football team. I picked them to win the division. I thought they could be a dark horse to get out of the NFC. I didn't think the defense would be this bad. But Mike McCarthy has dealt with a good amount of bad luck when you talk about all of the players that are on IR, especially on the defensive side. And who knows how this offense would have looked if the offensive line stayed healthy. You had Dak Prescott out there. It's a much different dynamic than the way we're currently seeing the Cowboys. I mean, Monday probably was rock bottom for them against the Arizona Cardinals, but we'll see this weekend. There's no reason to believe that their offensive line is suddenly going to be able to protect Andy Dalton against that ferocious Washington defensive front seven.
Do you think Dak Prescott's negotiating ploy is just going to be to mail this footage of this game against the Cardinals that happened on Monday night, first game he hadn't played in 4 years, basically, and be like, hey, you counter based on this?
I think every game that the Cowboys lose without Dak Prescott, especially by double digits, he just starts tacking on an extra zero. And maybe by the time he ultimately gets to the negotiating table, he's trying to get himself $60 million a season and taking up 78% of the Dallas Cowboys salary cap going forward.
It's really funny. Todd Fuhrman, I will see you later on today on the program. Appreciate you coming on early with us, hanging out, and hopefully we'll have some good football to talk about next week as well.
Always look forward to it. Enjoy the rest of the day.